A good day and welcome to this CNBC Africa special broadcast. My name is Tanya Habimana. And during the past few years, companies globally are ramping up their efforts to drive sustainable transformation across Africa. Stakeholders are increasingly recognizing the interconnectivity between the economic, social and environmental systems, as interconnectivity highlights the urgency to transform our collective growth path to be more socially inclusive, to have low carbonization and to be resource efficient. Now, whilst ESG factors are increasingly influencing the way in which organizations operate, how can we use our resources to drive a just transition to a low carbon economy that also addresses our most pressing societal challenges? Let's meet the panel of experts who will help answer this question. Tandekile Humalo Matenga, Sustainability Leader, Africa Sustainability and ESG Practice at Accenture. Portia Bangerezako, Head Sustainability at Old Mutual. Shamila Ibrahim, Chief Sustainability Officer at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Dr. Mumbi Washira, Accounting Lecturer, Strathmore University Business School. ESG, sustainability, and how it is affecting the African continent and how we can best use these initiatives to drive a socially inclusive transformation. That is what we are going to be discussing on this special broadcast. I'd like to start the conversation by addressing my first question to Dr. Mumbi. Now, Dr. Mumbi, you've spent a considerable amount of years looking at sustainability and how it is affecting the African continent and how we've been doing it. So I want to ask you, paint us a picture of what sustainability looks like on the continent. Where are we?
Thank you so much for that question. And indeed, if I were to give it any justice, I would spend more than 5 hours discussing it. So I will summarize it to the best of my ability. I'm going to give my answers from the context of accounting, which is really around how companies addressed their ecological, social, and governance impacts within their corporate reporting practice. I think first, there's generally a lot of research on how organizations tie the reporting practices on environmental, social, and governance issues to the economic performance of the firm. And I would like to say that for most countries in Africa and research done thereof, most of which stems from South Africa, we see a strong correlation. And what that means is just that it makes business sense to actually think about your sustainability as an organization. I think the second stream is that we now have a lot of policy guidance and regulation when it comes to sustainability reporting practices. I think South Africa is the best case example, and that's the country I've done most of my research on. I think about the King IV guidance for corporate governance, and I think about broad-based Black economic empowerment and that act that requires companies to actually think about issues to do with equity across race. We see generally that there's a lot of government imperative to encourage organizations to think about their sustainability. The third stream that I see now emerging is strategy and how organizations embed ideas of what we call shared value, or what we'll just call corporate sustainability, within the organization, and how that then is scaled across different institutions, and how that again also leads to economic performance. So there's a lot of research that's being done in these areas targeting corporate organizations. But I would also just like to say, given that COP27 is happening in Africa for the first time in Egypt this year, there is, between 2021 and 2022, a lot of research being done on renewable energy investment in Africa, and what kind of financial mechanisms are actually needed to support adaptation and resilience across the continent. So these are just some broad ideas I have, I've seen in my own experience. But again, I'll be happy to touch on more if time allows for this as well. Thank
And
you.
most definitely we will. And I really like what you say. It makes business a sense to be implementing ESG and sustainability initiatives for companies. But now, as we know and as we've seen time and time again, for a big part, ESG initiatives have remained aspirational. Businesses are not exactly where we need them to be. So, Thandekile, I'd like to address my next question to you. What have been the main challenges for businesses in implementing sustainability? The sustainability agenda?
Good afternoon, Tanya. Good afternoon, fellow panelists, and thanks for having us today to talk about this very important topic. So I think for myself, before we actually say what are the challenges or look at what are the opportunities for us in Africa, I think we need to take a step back and look at what countries or continents that are ahead of us, what they've managed to do right. And reason for that being is they were faced with similar challenges as us. It's just that they faced these challenges earlier on. So I'd like to look at Europe as an example. With Europe, it's a very heavily industrialized continent. They've got bigger population growth. So instead of waiting for disaster to hit, they actually did something. And I think it brings back to what our challenge is. It's that our biggest challenge is starting to do something. Europe didn't stop to see what was going to happen. They started. And they started recognizing the opportunities. I'll use the likes of the Netherlands. One of the things that they established early on was to make vehicle licensing more expensive. So this meant that people had to find other modes. And as we know, a city like Amsterdam heavily relies on bicycles for transportation. That's reducing carbon emissions in the city. In London, early 2000s, they also introduced congestion charging, meaning that to get into your car, to drive into the city, you also have to actually pay. So I think first, understanding where you see the challenges and then finding opportunities for those challenges should be our first step here in Africa. And then finding solutions that will better us as that can be localized for our context as Africa. And to go back once again to your question to say, what is the challenge? Second one is we lack coordination. So yes, Africa as a continent is very unique. So what you apply in Egypt might not necessarily work for South Africa. However, I think we are missing out on a lot of opportunities where we can actually work together as one continent. You have Rwanda at the moment that has managed to abolish or to stop the use of plastic bags altogether. And here you look at South Africa, one supermarket is saying no to plastics, and another is still allowing the use of plastics. So I think we lack that coordination. And if we can find a way of coming together, like people in Europe have actually done, we can actually find a solution moving forward.
Absolutely. And I really like that point, specifically when it comes to coordination, because that's where we can see governing bodies such as the JSE playing an important role in being able to drive a cohesive implementation agenda for sustainability. So my next question goes to you, Shamila. As the JSE, how do you see the role in terms of governing or perhaps providing a structure to companies to be able to drive a sustainable agenda?
Thank you, Tanya, and hi to everybody. Thanks so much for having me here today. Great to know that you have listener interest in a topic like this. I think when I look at back, let's take a step back from governance, firstly, and look at some of the imperative. And I think a lot of that some of the speakers have covered already. Now, from a JSE perspective, certainly there are different avenues and different levers that we can use. The one absolutely is regulation. And if you consider that from when the sustainability topic really became a major topic, which was probably going back to the 80s, really what it was considered is at the heart of good governance. So not explicitly considering issues of society and environment are really contrary to what we should be doing in stewarding within our organizations. And, I think we've heard it being said before that a company won't be able to succeed in an operation or environment or a society that is failing. And so understanding and seeing itself as part of the broader context is very important. And it has often been why within South Africa, for example, our governance landscape is actually quite advanced in that regard. Earlier on, when we talked about the King Codes, for example, and the King Codes of corporate governance have, at least since King II, explicitly been talking about the need to consider your people, planet, profit lens, and that the highest level within a company, which is the governing body, the board, needs to apply its mind to those issues using a materiality lensing. Why is it material to me? Which of these issues are material, and bringing that into the context of that business model. And so when we look at that, there's that underpinning of governance. Now, in the JSE's context, for example, companies are required to report in line with the recommendations of the King Code on an apply and explain basis. And so while there isn't a mandatory kind of, tick box approach to sustainability reporting and saying these are the 30 indicators you maybe need to look at, there's the underpinning of the fundamental about where you should be thinking about it, which is this integrated thinking concept, and says, bring it to the heart of your business model and your governance practices within your organization, and then understand that, which is very aligned to actually interrogating what is your social license to operate. And so when we look at that at the heart of business, that's one way of doing it, is to actually take it to the heart of governance and say, your highest level needs to be thinking about that. Then the other levers that the likes of a JSE uses, for example, would be able to say, well, that's on one side, and regulation can be a bit of a blunt instrument sometimes. So let's use that, and let's ask people to think about that differently. And that affects a plethora of issues, right, within organizations. And so it's not just trying to apply a tick box approach. The next one would be to say, what instruments could we offer to the market, and how can we help the fundamental reallocation of capital at that level across the board? And so there you have instruments like our sustainability statement, which is green bonds, social bonds, sustainability bonds, which allow for companies to actually ring fence a capital raise to use for outcomes directly related to sustainable development and the achievement thereof. And so that's another one, is instruments. And there are many such instruments that one can see in the broader sustainable finance landscape. Then, additional to that, there's probably two other levers that we look at, which is advocacy and engagement. And this is an area that I think all of us here today are involved in one way or the other, that says that, you need to actually continually be engaging, continually be advocating for this, because as yet it isn't a part of, for example, regulation and mandatory in many instances. Although we're seeing globally, there's certainly a push towards, for example, mandatory disclosures on sustainability or certain policies that require certain things. And often this is to enable a broader vision that a country might have in relation to its objectives and what it wants to achieve in sustainable development. So a bit of a funnel, if you like, a vision of where you want to go as a country, and then bring that down into what that needs to translate into in terms of regulation, in terms of legislation, policy, and the like, and in practice, and what we're trying to encourage. So advocacy and engagement has a role to play in saying, continually have this discussion about where you need to go, so that as business you're driving behind that, and you're saying we want to do this, and how do we do that, and how do we bring together the different parts of an ecosystem to make that happen. In our context, a big part of our ecosystem really is our issuers, our listed companies on one side, and then on the other side, the investors, right? The investors are a big part of that market, and they are driving where they're putting that money into. And so the education, the advocacy around having that happen is very important. So as an exchange, there are a few levers we're using, and I'm hoping that makes it a bit clearer.
Absolutely. And on that funnel, I mean, when we go all the way through to the bottom of the funnel and the foundation of the funnel, we get to the citizen, society. And you mentioned the aspect of material impact. So this really poses the question of sustainability, and how does it actually impact and influence society? And that's why I want to drive my next question to Portia. How do you see this? How is sustainability being perceived by society at large?
Thanks for that question, and good afternoon, everyone. society is an important stakeholder, and I think for many companies such as ourselves, there's been a shareholder supremacy. We do a lot of things looking and focusing on the shareholder, but society is an important stakeholder. That's where we sell our goods and services. That's whom we sell our goods and services to. That's where we draw our employees, for example. So now I think we're looking through the ESG lens or through the sustainability lens. What we are now being forced to do, or being challenged to do rather than being forced to do, is to look at society as not just from a customer base in a one way. You almost like, it's three-dimensional. You have to look at, these are people who are interested in how I'm operating as a company. Therefore, I need to be transparent with how I am operating. It's also about the positive and negative impacts that my goods and services have on the same society. It's also about how I relate to them. So it just means that by looking at through society sustainably, you do not see yourself as an island, as a company. You're not seeing yourself as just from a capital point of view. You're looking at yourself as a fellow corporate citizen, and that asks you to change the way in which you work. It challenges you to look at society as a key lever, and also it also challenges you to speak to society, whether it's through your services or your goods, whether you are marketing. It asks you to look at society as a partner for growth, and that's an important thing. Tandegila spoke about coordination. Mumbi and Chamila, they are speaking around looking at ourselves as an ecosystem. So if we are part of this ecosystem, we need to work in a way that is looking at ourselves and not just thinking at ourselves as the end goal, but looking at how we bring in and what our outputs are for the betterment, and looking at a net positive. I hope that explains it.
Absolutely. And that's a really, really important point, the notion of ecosystem and how we all work together. And I want to direct my next question to you, Tandekile. Looking at the ecosystem, we've talked about businesses, we've talked about citizens, society, but what about the role of government, civil society? How do you view ESG considerations being driven by those three stakeholders, namely business, government, and civil society? What is their role?
Yeah. And yeah, certainly. Thank you, Tanya. And I'd like to just, I'm sure you saw I was nodding away as Portia was talking there. And I think, you know what, and it's a good point. This is our responsibility. It's our role as a society, as business, as a government to actually work together. And I can start with civil society. And Portia touched on the fact that as a business, society is looking at them as a company that provides services to society. So for me, as a person, I need to understand where I'm spending my money. I think it's time we hold companies accountable for that. We need to understand if they're being sustainable businesses. Your pension fund, do you know where your pension fund is being invested? So those are part and parcel of how us as society can actually be involved. And with businesses, sustainability is no longer a nice to have. You need to actually make it part of your priority. The same way that we look at sales, profits, etc., we need to make sure that sustainability is part of at least our top 5 KPIs. We need to elevate it to be part of our growth strategy. We need to make sure that we are actually communicating. So it's no longer just a CSI initiative or a tick box exercise to say, okay, I operate in this community, therefore I've built a school, I've built a clinic. We need to make sure that we are being sustainable and is part of the overall picture as we move forward. And thirdly, to look at government. The government, I feel, in my personal opinion, all they can do is provide us with the necessary frameworks and governance. I think it was Dr. Wachira who touched on the fact that certain countries are now moving into mandatory reporting. So we saw last week in Europe where they actually said for every country, I beg your pardon, for every company that actually operates in Europe, you actually need to disclose and you need to be audited on your ESG scoring. So I think those are the things that our government can make available. The JSE is already doing their part. So this is the part for our government to actually come in to say, hey, this is now part of our policy. And here's the framework that we're actually making available. And finally, I think one of the things that the government can do to better help businesses especially is around how they market what we are doing as a country. And what I mean by that is now we've embarked on the just transition. So there's a lot of independent power producers that are actually coming into play. I think if we market ourselves properly, it will help those businesses actually attract funding. I spoke earlier about the availability of green climate funding. So if we are marketing ourselves properly, we will in turn attract the funding, because also a business alone, local businesses alone are not enough to fund these projects for us. So once again, it brings back that working together, everyone has their role to play in this whole context.
Yeah, absolutely. And an important point there, and that really speaks to the advocacy and the engagement and how we're pushing forward the initiatives that are happening on the continent to the outside world. But another point that you mentioned earlier is that of mandatory reporting and some initiatives that are happening across the world. But in order for us to have mandatory reporting, we need to have a common understanding of what an ESG lens or an ESG operating environment looks like. So I'd like to direct my next question to you, Shamilia. Is there a common understanding of operating with an ESG lens? Do we have one?
You gave me the easy question. Thanks, Tanya. So I think that is part of the question. That is part of the issue, is that there isn't necessarily a clear common understanding. I think we have bits and pieces of it. Even the ESG acronym is slightly misleading in ways, and it may be a little bit problematic. When we talk about ESG generally as an issue, we're looking at mostly a risk kind of a lens, a risk mitigation sort of a lens, and we're not necessarily looking at it within the context of what we need to achieve in relation to sustainable development. So we need to take a step back and say, within sustainability, what is that we're trying to achieve? Are we trying to just do less harm? Or do we need to fundamentally shift towards doing the right thing and stewarding towards a way that enables, using the Brundtland definition, us to achieve our aims without compromising the needs or the ability of the future generations to meet their needs, right? And so that's really, if you look at that, sounds a little bit esoteric, but it isn't. It's really saying, how are we using, consuming, behaving, treating the environment, society at this point in time? And what does that mean in the future context and the condition in which that is going to end up, and therefore what future generations are going to inherit from us? Now, we've already sketched the context of the fact that we cannot survive, a business can't thrive in a society that is failing. It depends on that society and that environment for its own existence. So put that there first at the center. Now, when you look at the sustainability context, it's about saying there are finite planetary boundaries within which we need to operate and meet all of our needs and not compromise the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Within these planetary boundaries, there are social contexts and foundations that we also need to achieve. And when we talk about looking, for example, at things like the Sustainable Development Goals, those are some of the articulations of the things that we would ideally like to achieve. I mean, if we're having conversations about inequality, about gender inequality, general inequality, things like that, it's largely been as a consequence of us following economic or development models that tend to internalize profit and externalize costs to society and the environment. So partially there's a failing in our systems in not adequately pricing for a number of the things that we use. We draw down from common good, right? From society, from the air. Do you pay for that air that you use? And what's the consequence of you polluting that on the health impacts in general to society, and who bears that cost? So these are the things where we need to start thinking about how integral our thinking needs to be. And this is a system level issue, that we are inextricably linked to a broader context. And therefore, how should we be thinking within those boundaries? And then saying, whittle that down to then how we should be operating, that allows us to be able to still achieve profit, run businesses, but then what those businesses do and how they do it obviously becomes important. But at the same time, ensure that we're not doing so in a way that is compromising our social foundations. And I know that's a lot, but that really is the sustainability challenge that we're trying to unpack here. And so, thinking about your business in the context of boundaries, in the context of needing to achieve certain social foundations, is hopefully where we need to get to. And that, I think, is the broader sustainability context that we always need to bear in mind and understand that, for example, ESG is a shorthand for some of the issues that we know we need to unpack in relation to this broader challenge.
Yeah, and that is such a powerful statement. We tend to internalize profits and externalize costs. And that really speaks to this notion of integral thinking and how we have to move forward using sustainability, ESG, as a business operating environment, as a strategy, and not necessarily isolated. But that brings the question in terms of reporting and how companies do that. Now, Dr. Mumbi, I know that you spent quite a bit of time looking at integrated reporting and how that can be done for companies. So what should companies be doing in order to grow in a sustainable way?
Thank you so much. And, as we're all talking, even Shamila, I just kept saying, wow, these are this is my community. I think the first thing, and I'm borrowing these ideas from a forum that was held by the University of Bristol. They call themselves the Accountability, Sustainability and Governance Research Center. And the first thing they were asking is, how are we actually going to, if at all, provide some unity in the way we understand sustainability reporting, integrated reporting? I think the first thing is quite closely related to what Shamila has said. It is what we call a double materiality perspective, which means that organizations that want to embed integrated reporting and, as a precursor to that, integrated thinking, the first thing that they must accept and internalize is that the financial sustainability is interdependent with that of the planet and the society. That's the first step. It's a baseline. It's not just impact to, it's impact from, and thinking about that now from the perspective of one strategy. So really, it's that thing where we need to understand that yes, your ability to create value over time, which is really the goal of integrated reporting. It is how an entity creates value over the medium, short and long term. It's understanding that those activities are unsustainable if the organization does not simultaneously look and think about its ecological and social impact. And that hinges on the way you think about your business model. So I have to say, when I started this journey of exploring sustainability and integrated reporting practices in Africa, I always looked at the report because that is what a lot of accounting, academic practice looks like. But then later I realized, no, this actually begins with a strategy and how that is scaled throughout the organization. So the first step is really understanding double materiality and ensuring that this idea is driven by leadership. I think the second one that I've seen now with good practices regarding integrated reporting is precisely what Shamila said. Yes, you're exploring value creation through the business model over time, and you're thinking about different sources of value, not just economic capital, but you're thinking about the societal value that you benefit from and give back. You're thinking about, the environmental capital as well, or what we call natural capital. But I really think that the organizations that seem to do this well align that process, that thinking, to the imperatives of the Sustainable Development Goals. So what does that mean? It means that as you're thinking about the value creation process, the impacts that you're measuring over time, you're thinking about how those then align with specific SDGs that actually align quite closely to your business model. So sometimes when you tell people this, they say, okay, so do I need now to look at my 17 SDGs and now how I'm contributing to all of them? And I say, no, it just is about thinking through which are the priority areas, back to the materiality discussion, and then aligning that process to your reporting and your strategy. The third thing I'd also like to say is, and it ties in with what has been said about the just transition as well, is one, understanding that there's a Paris Agreement. We have agreed to cut global emissions and keep them below 1.5 degrees Celsius, ideally. So if we've done this, then there's a way in which we can actually align our emission reduction targets and the reporting thereof to the Paris Agreement. And there are different frameworks one can use for that. The popular one is what we call science-based targets. So in Africa, I think there are only less than 30, I think the number is 28 companies that have set a science-based targets and include that in their reporting process. So again, as we would say here, the work is ours to do. So those are some of the main ideas I think organizations should think about as they think about their integrated reporting and sustainability reporting process. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Mumbi. And of course, we can't talk about reporting without talking about transparency, right? And when we're looking at transparency, that's been one of the things that has been coming back when it comes to ESG and ESG sustainability reporting. So I'd like to direct my next question to you, Portia. How do we ensure that we move forward in full transparency? How do we keep government and non-government actors acting in a transparent way?
I think there's quite a lot of work that has happened in the space. There's a number of, especially I think after COP26, there's been a lot of developments in giving standards or trying to standardize or codify how we go about speaking about sustainability and aspects of sustainability, and then ensuring that, there's been a lot of discussions around not greenwashing as companies, but so there's a number of ways in which we do that, but it all has been about improving our internal processes first to be able to be something that you can, if there was an external auditor or that would come and look at what you say, not just the narrative but the numbers that are attached to them. So it is around transparency, and also this space, before it became an issue of competitive advantage, I think there's been an acceptance that we are all in a learning curve, but we also have to do this very quickly. And so as companies, in the reporting space, I think year on year you find that there's a lot of improvement with process, with narratives, but then also with numbers. So I think as we are becoming more, and then the stakeholders are pulling us and making us accountable, we are showing up in terms of, I show what my management agenda on this issue is, and this is what I have done so far. And also being balanced, because not everything that we do is perfect, and being balanced in our reports, not just to make them marketing documents, but also just really realistically showing what are the issues that we face and what have we done well, what are we going to do next year, but also what we haven't done well and what we are going to improve. So I think from a company side, there's been a lot of that happens. I can't speak for governments, but I think also the development goals and the fact that in each of the countries you have an entity within governments that speak on that also gives us an opportunity then to upscale what we've done on a company level, but then on a country level, then there would be a government department that speaks on that. So there's been, I suppose, I would say we are going in the right direction at varying speeds, but the important thing is that this issue is no longer a Cinderella issue, but it's very much connected to how our strategies are going to develop and how we are going to grow.
And we can't talk about business and growth, year-on-year growth, without thinking about what's happened over the last 2 years, the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm quite curious to hear from your perspective, Shamila, what has been the effect of COVID-19 on businesses from a strategic sustainability standpoint?
Tanya, the effect, I think, firstly has been, hopefully, I think it's certainly for a point in time, to shine the focus on these issues that we call sustainability issues, which largely, we've sometimes paid lip service to and maybe haven't progressed as far as we should have. What COVID-19 did was reveal, I think, ever more starkly the fractures that exist within society. And now I think we've also seen the cost of the existence of those fractures. Because sometimes it's easy to sweep many of these issues under the carpet, right? As long as I'm making my profits year on year, I'm doing what I need to do. I'm part of the economic growth story. By the way, I'm creating some jobs, and that's kind of that. But the consequences maybe of some of the models that we've pursued, we've now started to see. What has happened during COVID? We have seen a huge amount of stimulus that's happened globally. We've seen many countries go deeper and deeper into debt as they had to borrow to be able to deal with the consequence of COVID within their economies. And we know we're now sitting with a debt crisis in many parts of the world. And that was exacerbated by COVID. In some instances, you might even see people starting to default on the ability to repay that debt. And what is the consequence then? And what is the consequence when you're borrowing ever more on an economy that ultimately the people within that economy have to then bear the burden of in the longer term? So we started to see those consequences coming through. And then let's look deeply at saying why. Okay, it's one thing we needed to borrow money, but what did we often need to borrow that money for? We've needed to borrow that money to deal with some of the consequences of unsustainable development, of huge inequities. We've had to take healthcare to areas that they didn't exist in before, which maybe if we had invested in earlier on, we wouldn't have had to spend so much more in trying to deal with right now. We've had to deal with that. We've had to deal with people who've become unemployed suddenly because of the consequences of this global pandemic. Things like that, if we had stronger foundations for, we perhaps would not have had to spend so much of money on. And so we now suddenly saw that the economic consequences, and in many instances, we're a country as a case in point, who've seen just how much more obvious many of those inequalities became at that time, where you're talking about, yes, wash your hands all the time and make sure that you're maintaining basic hygiene when you have areas that don't have access to water, let alone the luxury of saying wash your hands 10 times a day. And so we're seeing those things become more stark, the real deficiencies in terms of our infrastructure planning, and that also coming to the fore and being more visible and seeing what the costs of those things have been. The other element that we need to think about when we look at COVID is that COVID, it looks at, effectively we're saying, is in the family of zoonotic diseases, right? Which means that in many instances can be traced back to jumping from the animal kingdom possibly ultimately and then into us and then being transmissible to humans. Now, why do those things happen? And largely it's because we've encroached so far into the natural environment that becomes the consequence of it. And then we're seeing the impact of that encroachment of the natural environment. And by no means am I suggesting that one should not encroach at all on the natural environment, but there's a level, again, within which that is safe and that we need to do that and we understand the consequences of that. But the moment we do that irresponsibly is when we're starting to see these consequences that in many instances we ourselves can't adequately price for or understand or know what the multiplier effect might be going forward. And so those are some of the things where we're seeing this encroachment on environmental issues, the fractures within societal issues, actually starting to have a serious economic consequence as well. And for me, that is really one of the clear examples of what COVID has shown us. And it's also then hopefully pointed to us the opportunity to invest differently. We talk about build back better. I'd prefer to say build forward better. I don't want to build back the way it was necessarily, right? I want to build forward in a way that says, I've learned from this. And how can we do differently? How can we invest differently, understanding that not everything is a simple profit or loss? There's actually other ways in which you can start thinking about profit and loss. And, we can go into a long debate on that, but I'll leave it at that in terms of understanding some of the impact of COVID and the things that it's giving us the opportunity to hopefully do differently.
So what I'm hearing here is that COVID gave us health impact, which we all know of, environmental impact, societal impact, social impact, and all of this had consequence on economic impact. Tandekile, from your perspective, what has been the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic from a sustainability strategic standpoint?
Okay. Thank you, Tanya. So in terms, and just to add on to what Shamila was actually saying, I think, what she highlighted very important factors, which I think it was as painful as the process was, what we all went through in the last 2 years, but it has created that learning curve. And it hit many companies, many businesses very hard. So I think many businesses were then faced with that challenge of, what do I prioritize? I'm trying to keep my employees. However, many had started on their sustainability journeys, as part of their strategies. So it became almost you had to choose on what actually stays, what actually goes. However, I think it also created a small opportunity for us, if we can look at it that way. I mean, look at all of us. We're currently working from home, and you have to ask the question that, where if I live in Joburg City Center, is it necessary for me to drive to Pretoria for a meeting, or just to be present in person when I'm creating emissions along the way? So I think we should also take on the positives in terms of our strategies going forward, from our learnings. We have reduced a lot of waste. I mean, I look at Accenture as a whole. We now do things differently. So when I go into the office, there are certain measures that have been put in place. To use small examples, like our coffee cups. Instead of throwing away that just because it's a disposable cup, why not hold on to it for the whole day? Because now we understand how limited our resources are. And I think that was something that we also learned, we took away from, the COVID-19 pandemic. So I don't think we should necessarily focus on only the negatives. We should actually say, hey, what did we learn from this? What can we do going forwards, as a country and as a society?
Absolutely. And that's something that we've heard a lot on this channel, actually, how the COVID-19 pandemic, yes, brought a lot of negative and hard impact. Lives were lost, but that it also heightened what we like to call collective consciousness, where overall people are just more aware of the way in which they're operating in this world. They're a lot more conscious in terms of their health, in terms of their environmental, in terms of their general impact. And that really speaks to the notion also of risk management when we're looking at companies and how companies are managing the potential risks and shocks that are coming their way. And that's where I'd like to ask you, Portia, in terms of the insurance industry, what are the kind of risks that are being faced?
Okay, now thanks for that. So as a company, or in the space that we are in, that luckily we've been given the words to use around the type of risk, and in general there's a plethora of risks that we work. Our business is about risk, but in terms of climate change, specifically, we are looking at physical risks. Those are the ones that we can see, the floods, the fires that affect us. But then the one that is more important, I suppose that the more that is more difficult to sort of model for are the market risks or transitional risks, as we look towards this world that is becoming very, very unsure as to what the future is going to be. What does this mean for us, especially here in Africa, where we are very dependent? I mean, in our case, in South Africa, we are very reliant on coal as a source of energy. What does this mean? What will happen if the world decides to abandon coal? Are we going to be left with a lot of stranded assets? What happens when there are shifts in reputation, for example? And so those are the kind of risks that we are planning for, that we're looking at, and not forgetting the physical risks. And going back to what has happened, post-COVID is, I think a word that showed up often was around resilience. we've been tested on our resilience, and many of our systems, whether it was social systems, environmental systems, and even economic systems, we've been found wanting. And this is an opportunity to look at risks differently, whether they are physical or markets, and look at what is our state and what would be the ideal state be, and not knowing all the information in order to make models, as is in the case in the insurance industry. We try and model for things and check whether we've got it. We don't have all the information, but let's understand where we are and where we are going and how to navigate this with the information that we've got. And I think within the continent, we've got an opportunity to actually leapfrog. We've learned for what has happened from people having industries that are highly polluting, and then we can actually just manage. I like the words that were used by Shamila about building forward better. And I think that the continent is poised for that if we do not just focus only on profits, if we focus also on the systems that need to be improved.
And jumping on the boat of building forward better, I'd like to ask you, Dr. Mumbi, what are the best practices in terms of the just transition?
Thank you. And again, thank you, everybody, for these very insightful observations, because it's making me even just think on the spot. So the first thing I'd like to say is earlier this year, I was part of a committee, I still am, of an organization called PRIME. And for those who may not know what PRIME is, it's a UN Global Compact initiative that brings together academics from all over the world to advocate and to carry out research on any, research area on sustainable development. So for the first time ever, we had the launch of Chapter Africa. And we felt as a committee that we wanted to talk about a just transition for Africa. What's the role of business schools? So most of my comments here are coming out from that talk. The first thing that we have to accept, again, is that we are actually, the region that has contributed the least, right, to climate change. Our emissions level are negligible when we compare that with other regions in the world. But at the same time, we're the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And this will only continue to worsen over time. So where does that leave us? So sometimes when I teach this in sustainable finance in the master program, people say, but we didn't cause this problem, so others should fix it. But I always tell them, look, the problem is here. Whether or not we caused it is, doesn't matter. So what are we going to do? So the first thing is to look for the opportunities. So as I was saying from earlier, from a research perspective, we know that renewable energy consumption does correlate highly with economic growth. And this research has been done across different African countries. So we are sure that there are many opportunities with low carbon technologies. The complexity that happens, though, is when we have these discussions, people say, okay, so do we just transition immediately? But the thing is, we need to find a way to transition while creating economic opportunities for our people. And that's why it's a just transition. We are saying, how can we secure livelihoods while at the same time decarbonizing? And it may not necessarily look like an immediate jump. It may be having a diverse mix of energy sources that we use, and then over time we start to transition away. So one of the examples is actually in South Africa with Eskom, because they do have a partnership with other countries as well to do just that, to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, while at the same time having a clear strategy for how jobs are going to be created. So I'm quite interested to see over time how that will pan out. I also think we are a very attractive region for different sorts of financial instruments that handle climate change. And I think Shamila brought that out as well. I think grant-based climate financing regionally is a very good opportunity that we can leverage on. The third thing I also wanted to emphasize again is that we shouldn't see, climate change as being diametrically opposed to decent work. The two work very well together. And a common example that I have from my region is charcoal being used as a source of cooking. So, when we look at it immediately and you start telling people, please stop using this, stop cutting trees, then the thing is, are you giving them an alternative? So one of the things I've seen working very well here is giving people an opportunity to invest in tree planting projects. You involve the community, and then as a result of that, you have them relying much less on the charcoal and seeing actually the tree planting, initiatives as a way to sustain their livelihoods. So those are some quick examples I can think of, but I will stop it here because of time. Thank you.
And I like examples. Thank you very much. They help us. They help us frame things. They help us see things from a practical standpoint. And speaking of examples, I want to ask Tandekile. I understand that there's a project called the Net Carbon Cities that you're working on. Perhaps you could give us a little bit more information about what exactly this project is and also how it's going.
Yeah. Thanks, Tanya. Yes, so it's the Net Zero Carbon Cities. Yeah. So it's a very interesting project, actually, and it links back to exactly what we're talking about, which is decarbonization and our journey to net zero. So obviously, cities, are at the forefront of limiting global warming because, the global population, I think majority of us actually live in cities. Last time I checked, it was over 80% of the global population that actually live in cities. So although, as we've seen recently in KZN, that people that actually bear the brunt of this are actually our people in the rural communities. So therefore, we find that this decarbonization initiative needs to be driven from the cities because we're the ones who have the greatest emissions. And we produce a lot more of carbon. So given that many cities, including our cities here in South Africa, have actually committed to being carbon neutral, some have committed to 2030, some have committed to 2050. We need to find a way of working towards this goal together to make sure that it's actually realized. Given that's the case, us as Accenture, we've actually partnered with the World Economic Forum to come up with this net zero carbon cities. And Tanya, what it basically entails, it links back to what I was talking about throughout. It's about involving all the state actors. So we bring about the public sector, we involve government and the civil society through a process that which we call a net zero carbon city sprints. So it's just a series of workshops that we run in the cities that we've identified. We've already done this in other cities in Europe, and we've now brought it here locally in South Africa, where we've identified a couple of cities that we're actually working with. And all it means is that we say, hey, how do we accelerate on this journey that we have committed on going on, whether it's 2030 or 2050, what can we do to actually get there quicker? And to give you a few examples of things that we'll look at is around our power and energy, our transport and mobility, the buildings, and how we use our water and how we manage our waste. So this is where we bring in, which we even apply for most of our clients at Accenture, what we call the circular economy. So all it means is, what can we actually reuse? Where can we reduce our usage in terms of our limited resources? What can we recover? And most importantly, let's learn to recycle. So through this targeted methodology, we're able to actually localize all the solutions. So as all my panelists what they've been talking about, we need to make sure that whilst we walk on this journey, we are not, no one is actually suffering, we're not leaving anyone behind, but at the same time, we make sure that it's actually understood. If I say stop using coal, what's the alternative that we can use? So we've found that through this city sprint, we get to the solutions quicker, but what's more important is we are applying solutions that are relevant to the local context, because you can't take what has worked in Europe or the US and just come and apply it to the African context.
Yeah, very true.
So that is, in a nutshell, what the net zero carbon cities is all about.
Indeed. Thank you so much for that example. And still in the practical example sphere, I'd like to ask you, Portia, from an Old Mutual perspective, what are some of the initiatives that you are driving? And just in a few words, explain to us.
Okay, so we do have a number of initiatives, but what we are most considering is around social outcomes. But we have also signed up to net zero in terms of our stewardship of our investments, and then there's quite a lot that has been invested by Old Mutual around education, and then in the space that we are in, especially around financial literacy. And I think in these hard times, it has proven to be something that is very important, and there's something that actually touches people personally, how to manage their own personal finances. I would take very long to actually go through all of our initiatives, but what is important to note is that Old Mutual is very committed to social outcomes and also positive environmental outcomes, and a lot is actually available on our website. But those two are the ones that I thought would be important highlights for you to know.
Perhaps you could give us just one example. We've got about a minute left, and I'd love to find out a little bit more.
Okay, so there is also investment in entrepreneurs, and we are also looking at the green economy. And I think that's also just a fundamental to the way in which we want to work, is to not just look at initiatives in, we look at the society that we serve and what is important. And I think especially post-COVID-19, no, we're still in COVID, but we are looking at how do we look particularly in small and medium enterprises and push for entrepreneurship and have positive social outcomes, and and look at areas that are underserved. There's quite a lot that is happening, and I think post the floods as well, our foundation has been looking at disaster management. So disaster affects us, yes, in terms of our policy holders, but also there are people that are underserved or unserved, and there we've also been quite instrumental in disaster relief.
Well, I'm glad that I asked you that question, and that does bring us to the end of this conversation. I want to thank my guests who brought us more clarity on the opportunities that drive sustainable transformation. Portia Bangerezako, Head of Sustainability at Old Mutual; Tandekile Nkumalo Matenga, Sustainability Leader for Africa Sustainability and ESG Practice at Accenture; Shamila Ibrahim, Chief Sustainability Officer at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange; and Dr. Mumbi Wachira, Accounting Lecturer at Strathmore University Business School. That's it for today. Thank you very much for joining us, and goodbye.